Okay, this final session is entitled Critical Perspectives on the Future of Global Governance. So in a sense, some of the questions from the previous session that were hearkening towards this, hopefully we'll have a discussion of some of the issues that were raised in terms of alternatives to the existing system of global governance. I'm delighted that Richard Falk is joining the panel. I've asked him to act as a respondent, and I may have some comments after the two speakers. Saskia Sassen, who many of you I'm sure know of, and some of you know personally. She'll be our first speaker. She's the Robert S. Lynd Professor of Sociology and the co-chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. She's the author of many, many articles, books, publications on a wide range of very important questions, including globalization in all of its dimensions, migration, immigration, global cities. And I want to thank her personally for the work she's done on feminist circuits of survival, which I've actually also greatly benefited from. So thank you for that. So you will speak first, and then Upendra Baxi will follow. He was already introduced this morning. He is an emeritus professor of law in development from the University of Warwick. He was also the vice chancellor at the University of Delhi in the 90s, which, is it true, is it the largest university in the world, student-wise? I think it is. Wake up, Upen. I see, okay. See, he's deceptive like that. He's very sneaky. You think he's not paying attention, and then he makes his remarks, and you realize he's been processing lots of things. Anyway, he is a leading thinker in human rights theory and practice, and he's also very much informed by his active engagement with marginalized peoples. Stephen this morning referred to his legal interventions, his legal representation of victims of Bhopal, and we're very much looking forward to his comments. But I would ask Saskia Sassen to first please take the podium, and she's going to be relying on some slides to show you as well.
Hi, thank you. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers. Just, I don't want to repeat all the things or the thank yous, but just invoke all the thank yous that were done. Now, I just was reading the title of my talk, which is not my title. I think it's a great title. So, how will global governance respond to growing inequality and global dispossession? Now, the short version of my talk is, it won't. And now I'll give you the long version. Now, this echoes some of the issues already raised this morning, I would say, probably very specifically by, well, actually both speakers did. But the notion that existing global governance systems are actually in the business of maintaining certain alignments which privilege certain minorities and really devastate more or less the rest of the planet. And that is really hard work, you know, to protect a few small minorities against ravaging disasters in the most of the planet. And so it does, it has an incredible apparatus of institutions and brilliant creative classes, and I don't know, to do that kind of work. But ultimately, when the chips are down, I think that existing global governance systems are having a very hard time. I think they're sort of eroding. There's governance gridlock. I also think that there are very good, some very good, some very good efforts. I mean, the ICC is also part of that. A good part of the human rights regime is about that. But the question is, for instance, whether these good regimes, ICC, International Criminal Court, and the human rights regime, whether one of the reasons they function as weak regimes, which is sort of language to demarcate a certain type of governance regime, is precisely because they just don't fit comfortably, if at all, in some of these larger governance regimes. Now, frankly, do not really work in the global governance mode. That is not what, say, obsesses me. I better look at the clock because I'm chatting. I can tell that I'm in chatting mode. This is very hard now. I have to really focus. So my basic starting point with the question of globalization is that the existing master categories, including such things as global governance, if we are designating existing regimes rather than positing it as a project, as something that we need to develop, is that they're powerful, they explain, but they obscure too much. And it is that tension that has always interested me. Confronted with a powerful explanation, I don't reject it, but I immediately ask myself, what is it obscuring precisely because it is so powerful? So my zone, both for research, empirical research, and for theorization, has been the penumbra around powerful explanations. Now, that is different from a frontal rejection of powerful explanations. I think that there's a kind of history of an explanation. It assumes it acquires that power because it is getting at some things. So I include terms like immigration, discrimination, all of these terms, in other words, terms that capture complex realities. I think they are very powerful explanations, but they do also obscure matters. When I work on immigration, I suspend use of that term. They are too charged. It says too much. And so the question is, what else is happening? Now, in that spirit then of what else is happening besides that which powerful explanations are describing to us, I just want to focus on a couple of little issues in this talk. One of them is that perhaps one of the reasons that existing global governance systems, sort of the heart of the current global governance system. Again, I'm not talking about human rights, not ICC, International Criminal Court, etc. But the reason that they are not quite working in terms of questions of inequality and global dispossession is that I don't think, or I don't find them to have the instruments to address that which is being destroyed, that which is being expelled. Now, if you think of the human rights regime, it is positioned to capture that which is being expelled from certain protections, from certain guarantees of rights, etc. So it is not that a regime cannot do that, but I think that a lot of what is at the heart of existing governance regimes, especially in the sort of the corporate economic sector that includes finance, includes WTO, etc., is not well positioned to even see, if you want, or take notice of that the devastations, that which exits. Second little point derived from that, in my current project, I'm sort of working on a thesis, a hypothesis, that we really have shifted systemically from one type of organizing logic of the system to another one. Now, we're dealing with very complex systems, and the word system, I use it with quotation marks here. I think the Keynesian period, to simplify the explanation, was one which was marked by logics of incorporation. Not because it was nice, not because it wanted to include as many people as it could, but because systemically there was value attached to people as consumers, and hence as workers with a reasonable wage, etc., etc. There was a systematicity that combined to produce an outcome, and that outcome was incorporate people. In the current project that I'm doing, my hypothesis is that when our global modernity takes off in the 1980s, I think the system became marked increasingly by logics of expulsion. Now, let me say what I mean by that. I mean, for instance, methodologically speaking, and it matters where you position yourself to study a complicated set of really transformations, so they are mutant, they're mobile. I position myself in this study at the edge, if you want, at the edge of the system, figuratively speaking. Mind you, the edge of the system can be right in the center of Toronto or in Manhattan, etc. It doesn't mean sort of where there is nothing left. I don't mean it in that in that sense. I mean it systemically. So if you position yourself at the edge of the system, I repeat, in the Keynesian period, what you saw was incorporation of people. Again, as consumers, there was racism, there were exclusions of all sorts, but basically mass production, mass consumption, really a systemic valuing of people. And the basic clincher was consumers, really. Today, I argue, you see expulsions. Now, here is a problem, and I'm speaking a bit in shorthand. I'm looking at a whole range of processes of expulsion in the global north and in the global south. They're all partial. They're all fragments of a systemic movement, if you want. They're studied by very, very different specialized scholarships. So what happens when you look at the empirical data that is there, it takes on many different forms. It is not focused on this notion of expulsion. I am using the notion of logics of expulsion to bring them together into something that is a slightly more abstract level than the particularities. I am including such things as a kind of unemployment level that is not just simply more of the same, but that actually tips into a different, again, systemic logic, if you want. I'm including the fact that displaced people, the category of the international system, international humanitarian system, increased by 10 million. I mean, these are not precise counts, and they don't include, by the way, all the displaced people in the global south, reaching a total of 42 million. In other words, a disproportionate increase in the last, in the last few years, in the last year. I'm including the fact that in the United States, when you count them all, there are about almost 7 million people. It's a variable, of course. It keeps changing a bit, different moments of the year, etc. But 7 million people in detention. Now, some of these are honest murderers. They might as well. They are the real thing. They might as well be in jail. But many are not. We are, I argue, warehousing people. We're warehousing people in a whole variety of ways. In a more brutal sense, the reducing of what used to be perhaps a citizen carrier of certain capacities to make claims, to actually enjoy some rights at least, into now sort of basically laborers in much of the world, in conditions that destroy their bodies, etc. I don't want to become too dramatic. Or as the source of organs for the global organ market. You know, a real downgrading of people into a fairly elementary category. In there hangs up another variable which has to do with the fact that we are creating extraordinary assemblages of brilliant people, creative classes, advanced technologies, to basically produce very elementary brutalities. That notion of enormous complexity, PhDs from all kinds of disciplines, the best universities, vast amounts of real intelligence. To do what? To produce an elementary brutality. I think finance has a lot of that. When the multinational corporations benefit from outsourcing, where they may just save a cent on the hourly wage, it is not that. It is all the intermediate stuff that makes that little saving, you know, when you reduce it to the unit, if you want, which becomes a positive, a categorical positive, if you want. But it takes enormous complexity in between to achieve that, and it clearly is a financializing of it. So I don't need to elaborate on that. But that is sort of a basic notion that also runs through this project. Now, I would say all of these things, existing global governance models, have a lot of trouble even beginning to work with that. Because that is stuff that has, in a way, left the system. I exaggerate a bit now, all right? But it sort of is not under the control of the system in some sense. Maybe that last part, yes, when finance is involved, yes, but finance expulses, in turn, executes some of these expulsions. Now, it seems to me that a second critical point when I'm thinking about global governance questions is that at that point I also run into a problem with this duality, the global and the national, as foundational elements to explain. Again, as I was saying at the beginning, I don't reject them. They're very powerful explanations. When you say the global, you evoke geographies, histories, all kinds of things. The same thing with the national. They're powerful. My problem is, what are they hiding? And so in my latest book, which is called Territory, Authority, Rights, I stood back. I didn't want to fall off the conceptual cliff, in some sort of no man's land. But I did want to remove myself from that, and the basic categories that I'm using, and then I revisit them for this question of governance, is territory, authority, rights, complex, made, constructed. They are not just, territory is not ground, it's not land, it's made. It involves logics of power and also logics for claim making, a rights-bearing subject, et cetera. Most important, or the second most important point, besides the fact that they are made and hence capture all kinds of tensions and logics of an epoch, if you want, is that they exist in all more or less complex forms of social organization. Nomadic tribes also made territory, perhaps a territory carved out of other jurisdictions. Like the traders in the medieval times, between cities, they carved out a territorial jurisdiction for themselves through their moves among cities. That was not that of the king, that was not that of the church, that was not that of all the other jurisdictions that covered a given territory, if you want. So I'm interested then in understanding how they get assembled. Very quickly, I would argue that part of what we call globalization represents two things. One is a carving out, and I'm going to describe some of that empirically in a minute, a novel kind of very elementary jurisdiction that exists inside nation-state jurisdictions. But also finance, it is not just simply a powerful system. Yes, it is that. I'm interested in all the other things that it is. So it is an assemblage of bits of territory, authority, and rights that at one point may have sort of been captured with sort of the community, within the community of national states. Each state, there was a lot of redundancy in the system. It has these three elements as well. The Somali pirates create their own very elementary jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. So when I am trying to understand the question, how would this global governance system handle some of these issues that I'm looking at, I have a very hard time, but where I would intersect with the global governance literature is this notion that the existing of this epoch, because governance systems have existed for a long time, also actually produces assemblages of territory, authority, and rights. It doesn't use that language, and so my question at the level of research and theorization is, when I look at it that way, rather than saying global governance versus national, whatever, what do I see? Now, I want to give you a few of these more empirical elements about this notion of logics of expulsion. And so here, I'm assuming many of you are familiar with this graph. All you need to see is the curve. Are you familiar or not? It's a beauty. Every country should have it. This is the United States. It goes from 1917 to 2002. And in the next one, I'll show you quickly and update it. Now, what it shows is the share of national income that is received by, or you might want to say appropriated by, in this case, the top 10%. In that first epoch, which also gave us the first strong depression, at the height of that, like 1927, 1932, the top 10 appropriated up to 47% of national income. That class also, of course, has other sources of wealth. Then come the Keynesian years. 1942 is the dramatic fall. They're still doing rather well, but it has reduced a bit, so it's like 33%. And then 1987, it goes up again. Now, I want to dwell a minute on this Keynesian period. I said at the beginning that in a way the Keynesian period was marked by logics of incorporation. And if you take the same sort of measure, 5% per capita, growth on GDP, in the Keynesian years, it meant the growth of a middle class, growth of a prosperous working class. It did not mean that in that first epoch, nor does it mean in the second epoch. Secondly, this graph is also interesting because when you read the literature of that Keynesian period, the notion is it can only get better. The notion that it could revert to something that was negative, that disrupted those kinds of, say, growth of the middle class, whatever. It was almost inconceivable. Well, there we have it. Now, the second slide just takes that for the current period. This is 81, basically, to 07. The top 1%, same measure, only here after tax income, etc., growth of 281%. That's quite a bit. And then, of course, the bottom 16% over that period. Now, there is a lot of data. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but this is also quite striking. New York City, as you know, is sort of a machine for making wealth. It has 5 counties. It has the richest county, this is 2009 census data on income, the richest county in the United States and the poorest. I think that is an achievement. Systemically speaking, that is an achievement. In a country where you have the Alabamas and the Mississippis, vast numbers of poor, that you can actually have the poorest county. Now that indicates something also about a system that can accommodate these extremes of, very poor and very rich. And so when I was talking about these logics of expulsion, I want to understand to what extent we're seeing here expulsions that happen inside of what we're still measuring as one system, one unit. And this is just a description of that. Now, I think maybe you have gone on reading, but what the 2009 census data show, the 2010 census data, 2009 is for income, as you know, but 2010, is that the sons and daughters of the middle class, and these are people who are now in their mid-20s to late 20s, are making less money, and they're going to keep on making less money if things go more or less the way they are. They have achieved less education, unlikely that they will go on to achieve much higher education when you're 27, 28, could happen, and they're going to be less likely to own their homes. Now, this is a kind of eviction by a significant part of the young people of a project, a middle-class project. So I want to also think of that in terms of not simply, it's a little less of what they used to have, or, it's a little more unemployment. No, as a novel logic at work that hence also disrupts the viability of a lot of these governance mechanisms, etc. Now, I want to show you, raise a question here. The subprime mortgage. Now, you have all heard of that. I don't need to elaborate it, etc. But we have millions of households. By the time, because all the contracts have been done, so by 2014, we will have probably 15 million households evicted. That is 30 million people, 40 million people. I want to also add that to notions of logics of expulsion. What I'm doing here is also looking at the rich countries and how they contain within them these organizational logics. This is not just global north, global south. When you look at the global south, it is even worse. I find it also very interesting here. This is just one little photograph, 2002, 2006. This is a very short history, understand. It really starts in 2002. When those people who are, those percentages reflect people who have mostly lost their house, not all of them, but they mostly have lost their houses. You can see, like, if you take blacks, 2002, 4% of all blacks that got mortgages got subprime mortgages. In 2005, 47%. You see the figures, right? Very also by ethnicity, race, etc. Now, I see in that also a logic of expulsion. Now, the whole question of financial assets, there's going to be no time for this. But if you look very fast, finance is not just financial assets. That is why that is in quotation marks. Finance is about a logic, a financializing logic that subjects more and more sectors of the economy to its logic. It is simply a mistake to think of finance as something that is just a thing in itself. It is a live, process that moves and moves into more and more sectors. Now, very high, the reason our states are so poor is partly because, we taxpayers have become the last frontier to give, and now we're poor. You probably know that the United States extended $7 trillion. The legislature only approved $700 billion, but the executive branch of government extended $7 trillion. 21,000 transactions in the last 3 years, starts with Bush, including all kinds of foreign banks, all kinds of foreign firms, etc. To call this the return of the national strong state is simply a mistake. This is the executive branch of government using national law to get at national taxpayers' money to rescue a global system. And this is what is happening. This is the financializing also of, if you want, executive branch politics. So these, to me, all involve expulsions of certain projects. And the categories that we use and the sort of containers, if you want, do not allow us to see that. Nor does the literature on global governance really allow us to see these kinds of processes. Now, I wanted to finish with going back to this question of territory. And one of the issues, this is just one sort of trend running through all of this that I'm really interested in, is the land grabs is the shorthand term that is being used. And I want to read into that again, something else. So I'm, rather than just, again, back to powerful explanations saying, okay, this is commodification. Yes, it is commodification of land. Yes, it is a downgrading of territory, complex category with all kinds of, presumptions at least of rights, etc., to something very elementary. But what else is happening? And it seems to me that one of the other things that is happening is the formation sort of novel jurisdictions. When China, very elementary, very informal, but if you want structural holes in the fabric of the nation state, of national sovereign territory, etc. It's not so much a question of sovereign authority, as sort of a whole set of conditions that come together. Now, and so my argument is that we have these structural holes, we have these happen in the fabric of the national, and these new kinds of assemblages of territory, authority, and rights are emerging. When China buys 3 million hectares in Congo just to grow fuel, palm for fuel oil, that is not just simply buying land, that is altering the status of that huge piece of land. And that is just one example. Now, I had some slides here with, in the last, there has been, buying land has always happened. This is nothing new. Foreign governments, King Leopold said, let me go buy the Congo, he did. That is just one very dramatic example of stuff. What is different here is that after 2006, sharp growth in the curve of acquisition. So 30 million hectares are bought that we can count. I'm studying 93 contracts. I'm very interested to see the contracts. It's not so easy to buy land from one government to the other government. So they go through loops and holes. Again, the creative class is at work to produce these instruments. But anyhow, 30 million hectares between 2006 and 2008. By 2010, the best count that we can get, 70 million hectares. Now, 30 million hectares is the equivalent of all the agricultural land in Europe, just to give you a sense. We're talking serious structural holes, if you want, in the fabric of nation states. I'm not a defender of the nation state so much, by the way. The point here for me is the consequences of all of that. Now, here is, Africa, we all know. I'm just running through these very quickly because I have to end. Russia and Ukraine are major destinations. Sweden, South Korea, major buyers besides the familiar ones, Gulf, And of course, the financial services firms are buying lands. This is just one example. Morgan Stanley just bought some land, 40,000 hectares in Ukraine. This is not because they're about to become farmers, you understand. That is not part of the story. And there are all kinds of other things. And here is just read quickly because I don't want to spend the time talking about it. Anglo Gold, this is an example of a contract. This is an innovation. They are saying, we just want it for 15 years. This is a temporal dimension that runs through much of this. We just want it for 15 years. We want access to 250,000 liters of water per hour of doing our work, fracking. You can stay here, all the indigenous people, all the local farmers. We will give each of you, 600,000 Colombian pesos. Believe me, that's a lot of zeros, but that's very little money, 3,000. The people are seduced by it because nobody has ever offered them anything. Now, after they're done in 15 years, that is dead land. The toxicity in the bodies of these people is going to be very high, but they may not be dead in 16 years. It may take only 30 years for them to die, etc. And so this is a novel model that they say, we don't even need to displace you. So what I see here are a whole range of issues. I've just given you some examples that we need to begin to capture in our discussion of global governance. I think we need systems of global governance. But what I see now, I put myself at the extreme, as I said, at the edge of the system, where it's totally brutal. But that is one of the zones where we need to somehow also develop the instruments to do this kind of work. Thank you very much.